The chandeliers didn't care. 300 crystal drops. Each one catching light and throwing it back like an insult. The Drayton Grand Ballroom was full of money, full of silence, full of people who had learned to look through anyone beneath them. Karen Vale didn't move. He sat at the far end of the marble bar, alone, one hand wrapped around a glass of amber liquor he hadn't touched in 40 minutes. His white hair was swept back. His suit, dark, tailored, nothing flashy, sat on him like armor. His jaw was set. His eyes were steady. He wasn't watching the room. The room was watching him. That's how it worked with Karen. You didn't look at him directly. You watched him the way you watched something you weren't sure was sleeping. Because men like Karen Vale didn't attend events like this to socialize. They attended to decide things. And no one in the Drayton Grand wanted to be one of the things decided. The Triplet Alpha Syndicate. Karen, Darian, and Zevon Vale weren't rumored to be powerful. They simply were. And tonight, Karen was the only one here. Which meant the other two had already finished their work for the evening. Which meant this one wasn't done yet. The orchestra played something European and expensive near the south wall. Waitstaff moved in precise choreography, trays raised, eyes forward, steps practiced. Guests clustered in formations that weren't accidental. In rooms like this, who you stood near said everything about who you were. And who stood alone said even more. Karen was alone. Not because he had no one. Because he chose it. The glass turned once in his hand. Clockwise. Then stopped. That's when the boy appeared. He came from the east corridor, the one that connected to the service entrance. He was small. 6, maybe 7. Brown hair messy at the crown, hoodie grey and slightly too large, sneakers worn at the toes. He moved fast. Not running, but close. The walk of someone who had learned that running attracted attention. He wove between legs. Between gowns. Between conversations that mattered to no one like him. He was heading somewhere specific. He was heading toward Karen. The boy stopped 2 feet away. Looked up. His chest was rising and falling fast. His eyes, wide, dark, too old for his face, went from the glass in Karen's hand to the gold cross at his collar to finally, carefully, his face. Then the boy leaned forward. Rose up on the balls of his feet. Cupped both small hands around his own mouth. And whispered, barely sound, just warm breath and urgency, directly into the space beside Karen's ear. Please, just pretend you're our dad. Just for tonight. The glass stopped turning. Karen didn't move. Didn't flinch. Didn't pull back. He sat exactly where he was, one elbow on the marble bar, expression unchanged. But his eyes, those flat, unreadable eyes, shifted. Just slightly. Just enough. The boy stepped back. And that's when Karen saw him. The Omega. He stood 8 feet back, near the column at the edge of the main floor. He wasn't looking at Karen. He wasn't looking at the boy. He was looking at the floor, a specific spot of polished marble just past his shoes, with the focused stillness of someone counting down to something bad. His name was Lee Min-suk. Though Karen didn't know that yet. What he knew was what his eyes told him in the first 4 seconds. Slight frame beneath a hoodie that matched the boy's. Hands at his sides, fingers straight, not relaxed, controlled. Shoulders drawn inward. Jaw tight. A bruise on the left side of his wrist, just below the sleeve's edge, the kind that came from something gripping, not something falling. He was braced. The way you brace when you already know what's coming. And it came. Oh look, another stray managed to sneak in. The voice came from a cluster of 3. 2 men, 1 woman. All in formal wear. All holding drinks. all smiling the way people smile when they've decided something beneath them has just become entertaining. The taller man tilted his glass toward the Omega. Mute one, isn't he? Heard about this one. Showed up at the Hargrove benefit last spring trying the same thing. Charity case. Laughter. Not loud. Controlled. The kind of laughter that was designed to be heard without appearing cruel. It was worse. The Omega didn't look up. The boy's jaw tightened. That's embarrassing, the woman said, voice cool. Bringing a child into this. Using him like a prop. The boy's hands curled at his sides. And Karen watched. He watched the Omega's breathing, slow, deliberate, the kind of breathing that had been practiced into muscle memory because panic was a luxury that got people hurt. He watched the boy's eyes go from Karen to his father and back again, making calculations a child that age shouldn't have to make. He watched the crowd that had gathered, not gathered exactly, shifted. Bodies turning incrementally. Conversations pausing in that particular way that meant everyone was listening while pretending they weren't. What makes cruelty dangerous isn't the insult. It's the audience that allows it. The taller man took a step forward. The Omega took one step back. And the boy, this small, worn down, too alert boy, turned back to Karen. His voice, when it came again, was barely there. They're going to separate us again. Hi viewers, have you ever been in a room full of people and felt completely invisible, like no one would speak up even if something wrong was happening right in front of them? The words hit differently from a child. Again. That word carried weight. History. A pattern that had repeated enough times that a 6-year-old could predict it. Karen's gaze moved from the boy to the Omega. Minsak had finally looked up, not at the crowd, not at the men mocking him. He was looking at Karen now. Just for a second. One brief, involuntary second of eye contact before he dropped his gaze back to the floor. But it was enough. In that second, Karen didn't see fear. He saw something much more complicated. The glass in his hand lowered. Set down on the marble. Gently. The sound was small, a soft click of glass on stone, but in the bubble of silence that had formed around this moment, a few nearby heads turned. Karen didn't move yet. He looked at the boy one last time. Something in his expression shifted, not warmth exactly, not softness. More like the moment a decision gets made. The kind that doesn't get unmade. And across the floor, behind the column, the Omega's breath caught. Because Karen wasn't looking at the crowd anymore. He wasn't looking at the guards who had begun moving toward them from the east entrance. He was looking only at the boy. And the boy, against every instinct survival had built into him, looked back without fear. The guards moved like they had done this before. Because they had. Private events at the Drayton Grand had protocols for exactly this kind of situation: unauthorized guests, unwanted presences, social disruptions. The protocol was simple. Locate. Approach. Remove. And the whole thing was designed to feel quiet, so the rest of the room could keep pretending it hadn't seen a thing. Two of them peeled away from their posts near the south entrance. Both tall. Both wide at the shoulder. Both moving with the particular confidence of men who had never once been told no by someone who couldn't afford to. Lee Minsak saw them coming. Of course he did. He had been watching exits since the moment they walked in. That was the thing about Minsak. The thing no one in this ballroom could see because they weren't looking closely enough, or because they had already decided he wasn't worth looking at closely. He was not panicking. He was calculating. There was a difference, even if from the outside, both looked the same: stillness, downcast eyes, controlled breath. But panic was reactive. What Minsak was doing was something else. He was reading the room. Timing the guard's pace. 16 seconds to reach him from the south entrance, give or take. mapping the nearest service corridor 9 feet to his left, partially blocked by a catering cart. Measuring the distance between himself and his son 8 feet, too far to grab Jay quickly if this moved fast. His son, Jae Min-suk, 6 years old, currently standing 2 feet away from the most dangerous-looking man in the room, watching him with eyes that held zero fear. That was the part that tightened Min-suk's chest. Not the guards. Not the humiliation. Not the laughter still drifting from the cluster of guests who had made them into tonight's entertainment. Jay. Because Jay didn't flinch the way he should. Jay had learned, from watching his father, from years of being moved around and handled and talked about like he wasn't present, to go very still when things got bad. But right now, Jay wasn't still. Jay was hopeful. And hope, in their world, was the most dangerous thing a person could carry. Min-suk's fingers moved at his side, barely. A small motion. 2 fingers extending, then curling back. Their code. Come back to me. But Jay didn't turn around. Min-suk exhaled through his nose. The cluster of guests had grown. Not loudly, this wasn't a scene anyone wanted to be visibly associated with. But bodies had drifted closer. A woman in a wine-red gown angled herself sideways, pretending to examine the floral arrangement while keeping them in her peripheral. A man with silver cufflinks leaned toward his companion and said something low that made her laugh. The laughter was light. That was the worst part. It wasn't even malice. Not really. It was boredom wearing Malice's clothes. They weren't cruel because they hated him. They were cruel because he was there, because he was different, because it cost them nothing, and for people who had everything, things that cost nothing were the easiest to waste. Min-suk had learned this. Had spent years learning the specific texture of this kind of cruelty, the way it moved, the way it dressed itself up, the way it ended. It always ended the same. The bruise on his left wrist throbbed. He didn't reach for it. He never reached for it in public. Reaching for it meant acknowledging it, and acknowledging it meant giving the room something to ask about, and questions led to answers he couldn't give. Because answering questions required a voice. And Min-suk hadn't spoken in 3 years, 2 months, and 11 days. Not because he couldn't. Because speaking had stopped being safe. Fear teaches the body to survive. But it also teaches it to disappear. He had disappeared, inch by inch, until what was left was just enough to keep Jay fed, Jay sheltered, Jay breathing, Jay safe. That was the math. That was all the math there was. The guards were 10 seconds out now. Min-suk's eyes moved to the service corridor. 9 feet. Cart partially blocking. If he moved now? A hand on Jay's shoulder. Large. Steady. Unhurried. Min-suk's whole body went rigid. But it wasn't a guard's hand. It was Karen Vale's. He had moved without Min-suk seeing him move, and that, more than anything, was what locked Min-suk's feet to the floor. Because men who moved like that, who closed distance without announcing it, were operating on a different level. They didn't rush because they didn't have to. The room reorganized itself around them before they arrived. Karen's hand rested on Jay's shoulder, not gripping, not pulling, just resting. Present. He was looking at Min-suk now. Not at the guards. Not at the cluster of guests. At Min-suk. Direct. Unhurried. Like he was reading something written in small print. Min-suk's chest did something complicated. He looked away first. Of course he looked away first. But not before Karen's eyes had moved, quickly, systematically. Down to his wrist, back up to his collarbone, across to his posture. It wasn't the way the guests had looked at him tonight. Their looks were flattened, dismissive, the kind you gave to objects. This was different. This was the way someone looked when they were building information. Building a picture. The guard slowed. One of them met Karen's gaze, then looked away. Min-suk noticed. He hated that he noticed. And then Karen did something with his left hand, a small gesture, barely movement. 2 fingers lifted. A direction given to the guards without a word, without a look, without anything that could be called a command out loud. The guard stopped. Stood. Waited. Min-suk's breath came out in one slow, controlled exhale. He stared at the floor. The laughter from the cluster had stopped. The woman in wine red had turned fully away. And Karen stood beside Jay, this man who had no reason to be here, no reason to care, no reason to do anything other than finish his drink in peace. And said nothing. He just stood there. Like a wall. Like a verdict. Like something Min-suk didn't have a word for yet. And then, slowly, Karen's fingers moved again. A different gesture this time. Not at the guards. Not at the crowd. At Min-suk. It was small. A direction. Follow. And somewhere behind Min-suk's ribs, something tight and old and exhausted asked a question it had no business asking. What if? He stood. That was the first thing. Not a lean forward, not a shift of weight. Karen Vale stood from the bar stool in a single unhurried motion, and it was like watching a building decide to move. Not fast. Not dramatic. Just complete. The kind of rising that came from a body that had never once questioned whether the space it occupied was its right. The amber glass stayed on the marble. He didn't take it with him. He walked. And the room. The Drayton Grand Ballroom with its crystal chandeliers and practiced silence and 300 guests who all knew exactly where they stood in relation to each other, parted. Not visibly. Not all at once. But it parted. People shifted weight. Conversations redirected. A man in a charcoal tuxedo stepped 2 inches to the left without looking down to check where he was stepping. A woman with her back to the room turned, saw Karen's trajectory, and chose a slightly different direction toward the bar. Nobody acknowledged it. That was the most telling thing of all. Karen reached Jay in 11 steps. He slowed the last 3. His eyes had been on the boy since he stood, not the guards, who were still holding their position near the south entrance, not the cluster of guests who had gone quiet. Just Jay. The boy who had walked across this entire ballroom alone, navigated between bodies twice his size, and whispered a desperate ask into the ear of a man he had never met. That kind of courage had a specific gravity. Karen had learned to recognize it. He crouched. Not all the way down, not the way adults crouched when they were performing gentleness for an audience. One knee dropped, one stayed up. He brought himself to eye level without collapsing the space between them. Jay stared at him. Didn't back up. You've been looking for me, Karen said. His voice was low. Quiet. Not soft. Karen Vale's voice was never soft, but calibrated. The kind of quiet that came from someone who had learned that real power didn't need volume. Jay blinked. His mouth opened slightly. This wasn't what he'd expected. Children who had spent time learning to be afraid were good at reading threats. Jay had clearly developed this skill early and developed it well. But Karen wasn't reading as a threat. He was reading as something Jay hadn't built a category for yet. Yeah, Jay said. Barely a word. Yeah, I asked you to. I know what you asked, Karen said. Jay's chin came up. Karen looked at him for one more second, studying something in the boy's face, some measurement he was taking, and then stood. Turned. And faced the room. He didn't make a show of it. Didn't look around like he was inviting witnesses. He simply straightened, placed one hand on Jay's shoulder. Steady, present, unmistakably deliberate, and let the room register what it was seeing. An alpha. Claiming a child. In the most understated, unquestionable way possible. The shock moved like a current. The cluster of guests, the ones who had been laughing, went still first. The taller man's glass lowered 2 inches. The woman in the wine-red gown turned back around, her expression rearranging itself from amusement to something more careful. One of the guards took a slow step backward. And Lee Min-suk, 8 feet away, shoulders braced, eyes on the floor, stopped breathing. Karen didn't announce anything. He didn't address the guests or the guards or the ambient judgment that had been forming around Min-suk and Jay since they walked in. He simply existed in the space between them and the room, and let what he was do the rest. Then he turned his head, just slightly, toward Min-suk. Come here. Not a command. Something adjacent to a command. A direction given with the certainty that it would be followed, because everything in Karen's bearing said he existed in a world where his directions were followed. Min-suk came. He moved carefully, not rushing, not stumbling, the controlled movement of someone managing their own body in real time. He stopped beside Jay. Kept his eyes down. Karen's gaze moved over him again. Quick. Specific. Then he crouched slightly. Not down to Jay's level this time, but enough to bring his face closer to Min-suk's averted one, and said something. Low enough that no one else in the room could catch it. 4 words. Maybe 5. His mouth barely moved. Jay looked up at his father. Min-suk went very still. His breathing, that controlled, practiced, disappearing kind of breathing, broke. Just for a second. Just long enough for something to pass across his face that wasn't fear, wasn't relief, wasn't shock. It was recognition. The kind that didn't make sense yet. The kind that landed before the explanation arrived. The guards near the south entrance exchanged a look. One of them touched his earpiece. The cluster of guests had fully separated now, each person redistributing themselves into other conversations with the careful speed of people who had decided they hadn't been watching. But they had been. And they had seen. And what they had seen was Karen Vale, youngest of the Triplet Alpha Syndicate Kings. Standing beside an Omega and a child that no one in this building had any reason to believe belonged to him. Claiming it anyway. Karen straightened. Adjusted his cufflink. And said, loudly enough for the immediate space to absorb. We're leaving. Not a question. Jay looked up at Min-suk. Min-suk finally looked up, not at Jay, not at the room. At Karen. His eyes were wide. Complicated. The recognition still there, still unresolved, led now over something shakier. He didn't move toward the exit. He didn't back away. He stood there in the particular suspended state of someone standing at the edge of a decision they hadn't made yet, waiting to see if the ground was real before they stepped on it. And Karen waited. 2 seconds. 3. He didn't push. He didn't fill the silence. He just waited. With the patience of a man who had never once needed to convince someone twice. Jay reached up. His small hand found the edge of Min-suk's sleeve. Tugged once. And Min-suk moved. For minutes. That was all the time the corridor cameras were down. Later, the building's security team would review the log. They would find a timestamp, 9:41 p.m., where 3 cameras in the East Wing went offline simultaneously. No error code. No system alert. Just a gap. For minutes of nothing, and then the footage resumed as though it had never stopped. No one would be able to explain it. No one would try very hard. Because the East Wing corridor was behind the Drayton Grand's kitchen service area, a stretch of narrow hallway, fluorescent lit, smelling of linen and catering prep, where guests weren't meant to be. Where the marble ended and the plain grey tile began. Where the gap between how this building presented itself and what it actually ran on became visible. Minsuk stood with his back near the wall. Not touching it, just near it. Close enough to use if he needed to. Jay was beside him, one hand tucked into Minsuk's, watching Karen with that particular attentiveness he had, that old eyes quiet, that made him seem less like a child waiting for something to happen and more like a child observing something he was already cataloguing. Karen walked the length of the corridor. Not pacing. Not restless. Measuring. He moved in a slow circuit, from the door they had come through, to the wall at the far end, back again, and when he came back to the center of the space he stopped. He looked at Minsuk. Minsuk looked at the floor. Karen let that go. For a moment. He stood at a distance that was just slightly closer than neutral, not crowding, not retreating, but present in a way that had weight to it. He wasn't performing calm. He was calm. The difference was in the stillness, the absolute steadiness of a man who had been in uncomfortable situations so many times that discomfort itself had stopped registering. He studied Minsuk. Not the way the ballroom guests had studied him, as a category, an intrusion, something to confirm a conclusion already made. This was different. This was slower. It moved detail by detail. The bruise on the wrist, old enough to yellow at the edges, recent enough to still be raised. The way Minsuk's right shoulder sat slightly higher than the left, a chronic protective adjustment. The way he held Jay's hand, fingers loose enough not to alarm the boy, tight enough to communicate what the rest of him couldn't say. Karen's jaw shifted. Why you? The words came out flat. No preamble. Minsuk's chin didn't move. His eye stayed on the floor. Karen waited. When no answer came. And no answer was ever going to come, because Minsuk didn't answer, hadn't answered in years, had built the whole architecture of his survival around not answering. Karen did something the corridor didn't expect. He didn't ask again. He didn't press forward. Didn't close the distance aggressively or try a different tactic or escalate. He simply accepted the silence. Absorbed it. And then he moved to the left side of the corridor where a folding chair sat against the wall. A leftover from some staff break, abandoned there, and he turned it around and sat down. Just Saturday. Elbows on his knees. Head level. Eye still on Minsuk. Not threatening. Not performing patience for an audience. Just there. Jay glanced up at his father. Then at Karen. Then sat on the floor, cross-legged, like the corridor was a perfectly reasonable place to settle in, and looked between them with that cataloguing expression. Minsuk finally looked up. Not at Karen's face. At his hands. The large, ring-adorned hands with their gold watch and their ease, hands that had crushed a glass and made guard stop without a word being exchanged. Karen noticed Minsuk looking. He turned one hand over. Palm up. The way you might show someone you weren't holding anything. Minsuk's gaze traveled up. Made it to Karen's collarbone. Stop there. Karen said, you've been moving around. Not a question. Minsuk's jaw tightened slightly. A long time. Still not a question. Both of you. Jay's head tilted. Karen looked at the boy for a moment. Something in his face changed when he looked at Jay, something small and uncharacteristic that didn't fit cleanly into any of the categories people usually assign to men like him, and then he looked back at Minsuk. You're not weak, he said. Flat. Certain. You're contained. Minsuk went still. Not the practiced stillness of someone managing themselves. A different kind. The stillness that comes when something hits a place that hasn't been touched in a long time. His eyes finally came up. Made it to Karen's face. Stayed there for 3 full seconds before dropping again. But in those 3 seconds, Karen caught it. caught the thing behind the defense. Behind the bruise and the calculated breathing and the 3 years of choosing silence because speaking had cost too much. It wasn't fear. It was exhaustion. The kind that had gone so deep it had stopped feeling like exhaustion and started feeling like the floor. Karen stood. He didn't move toward Min-suk. He moved toward the door. And paused with one hand on the frame. Same time next week, he said. It wasn't posed as a question. Min-suk stared at the back of his head. Karen left. The cameras came back online at 9:45 p.m. The corridor showed nothing, just empty hallway, fluorescent light, grey tile. No evidence of anyone having been there. No trace. Except for Min-suk, still standing against the wall, Jay's hand in his, staring at a closed door. And the folding chair, turned to face outward. The way Karen had left it. The second meeting was a Thursday. The third was a Tuesday. After that, neither of them kept track of the specific day. It was every week. That was the fact. Every week, in a small room on the 4th floor of a building Karen owned that Min-suk would later learn was not a coincidence. That practically nothing Karen did was a coincidence. They met. The room was plain. No marble. No chandeliers. A table, for chairs, a window that looked out over a stretch of the city that was neither impressive nor ugly. A cabinet along the east wall. The kind of space designed to be forgotten, to hold whatever purpose was brought into it without insisting on its own. Karen always arrived first. He was always there when Min-suk and Jay came through the door. Already seated, already still, with a pot of tea on the table between the chairs. He never explained the tea. Never asked if they wanted it. He simply poured it. 3 cups. Every time. Jay took to it immediately. Children who have spent significant time in instability develop an attachment to routine that is almost fierce in its specificity, and Jay had identified these meetings as safe, which meant every detail of them became precious. He sat in the same chair every week. He wrapped both hands around the cup the same way. He watched Karen across the table with the same open, calculating attentiveness. Min-suk Saturday. He kept his hands in his lap for the first 2 meetings, then, on the third, he reached for the tea. Karen didn't react. Didn't mark the moment. That was the thing about these meetings that Min-suk kept finding himself adjusting to, week after week. There was no performance of patience. No visible effort at warmth. Karen sat across from them with the same steadiness he had brought to the corridor that first night, present, watching, unhurried, and the absence of pressure was itself a kind of pressure. Because Min-suk kept waiting for the ask. There was always an ask. That was the pattern of every interaction he had learned to navigate. People who helped had reasons. People who showed up with resources and space and 3 cups of tea every week were building toward something. Min-suk had learned this early and learned it hard. But week 4 came and went. Week 5. Week 6. And Karen asked for nothing. He asked questions, practical ones, in a tone that was direct without being invasive. Where are you currently staying? Is that stable? Does Jay have what he needs for the school he's in? He asked them the way a man reviewed logistics, not the way a man assembled leverage. Min-suk answered in writing. He had started carrying a small notebook. Karen read his answers without commenting on the fact that they were written. Without remarking on the silence. Without making it strange. That, of all things, made Min-suk's chest do the complicated thing it kept doing in these rooms. Being unseen was familiar. Being seen the wrong way was familiar. Being seen, actually seen, the specific uncomfortable precision of being read correctly, and having it treated like it simply was what it was, no adjustment required, was not. Min-suk didn't know what to do with that yet. Dependence doesn't begin with need. It begins with relief. Jay, by week 7, had stopped cataloguing Karen. He had started talking to him. Not the careful, scripted kind of talking children do with adults they are uncertain of, the polished-up version of themselves they offer to people they don't fully trust. The real kind. The kind that jumped subjects without warning and asked questions that didn't have clean answers and offered opinions about things that nobody had asked his opinion about. He told Karen about the school. About the teacher who pronounced his name wrong every day even after being corrected. About the other kids. About a book he'd read 3 times because they kept moving and he couldn't get new ones. Karen listened. Fully. He responded, occasionally, directly, without talking down. Once he sourced 3 new books and left them on the table without mentioning it. Jay arrived, saw them, and looked at Karen with an expression that was trying very hard to stay controlled and losing. He didn't say thank you. He picked up the first book and held it with both hands. That was enough. Min-suk watched this happen and felt something shift in the math he had been running since the first night in the corridor. The math that said, "This is temporary, don't let Jay get attached, keep your weight off this floor because it won't hold." The math was changing. He didn't know if that was good yet. He wasn't ready to decide. On the 8th meeting, a Thursday again, the city outside the window grey and wet, Karen arrived with a different tea. Darker. Warmer. The kind that moved slower in the cup. He poured without asking. Jay reached for his immediately. Min-suk reached for his. And found that Karen had already shifted the cup to the left, anticipating the angle. The small, specific adjustment that could only have come from 8 weeks of watching. Min-suk's hand stopped on the cup. He looked up. Karen was looking at him. Steady. Unreadable. That particular quality of attention that had unsettled Min-suk from the first night and had not stopped unsettling him, only changed in character, from threat adjacent to something he still didn't have a clean word for. He looked away first. Again. As he always did. Jay drained half his cup in 2 swallows and then set it down with the decisiveness of a child who has made a choice and is already moving past it. "Dad," he said. Not to Min-suk. To Karen. It came out the way natural words come out, without friction, without pause, without any awareness that it was unusual. Just a word that had been organizing itself in the back of his mind and had finally found its moment to arrive. The room went quiet. Min-suk's breath stalled. Jay looked between them, at Karen, then at his father, then back at Karen, and for a split second his face showed the recognition of what he'd said. The waiting for correction. Karen looked at the boy. His expression didn't change. He didn't tense. Didn't sit back. Didn't reach for a clarification or a deflection or any of the dozen available responses that would have made the moment smaller. He simply held it. Let it exist in the room exactly as Jay had released it. Min-suk stared at the side of Karen's face. His notebook was in his pocket. He didn't reach for it. What he would have written, what was sitting right at the edge of everything he had carefully kept in place, he wasn't sure yet had a shape that words could hold. Outside, the rain moved across the window. Inside, the tea cooled in 3 cups. And Karen Vale said nothing. Did not correct the boy. Did not explain. Just poured a second cup. What does a child see that adults have already learned to stop seeing? Drop your answer in the comments. I want to know what you think Jay noticed first about Karen that his father didn't. He didn't come on Thursday. Min-suk sat in the chair he always sat in the room on the 4th floor, with 2 cups of tea going cold on the table. Jay was next to him. Both of them waiting. The window showed the same grey stretch of city. The cabinet along the east wall hadn't moved. The chair Karen always occupied was exactly where it always was, angled slightly toward the table, the way he always left it. Everything in the room was the same. Except him. Min-suk checked the door 4 times in the first 20 minutes. Not obviously. Just glances, the kind his body made before his mind caught up. By the 3rd glance, Jay had noticed. By the 4th, Jay had stopped talking. That was how Min-suk knew it was bad. Because Jay always talked in this room. This was the one place Jay talked like a child, loose and fast and without armor, and the silence that replaced it now had weight. Had specific shape. The shape of a child who had learned that when adults went quiet, it was usually because something was about to change. The hour passed. They left. Min-suk told himself it was 1 week. Schedules shift. People have things. The 2nd week, he didn't sit as long. He poured 1 cup. Drank it standing. Left. By the 3rd week, he didn't pour anything. He stood inside the door for 11 minutes, he counted, the way he counted everything now, because counting gave the body something to do while the mind ran its damage assessment, and then he turned around and walked back out. Jay didn't ask questions. That was the part that stayed with Min-suk. Jay was 6. Jay asked questions about everything. About the teacher who mispronounced his name, about the city outside the window, about why some teas were darker than others. Jay asked questions the way he breathed. But he didn't ask about Karen. He just stopped mentioning him. The way children stop mentioning things they've decided are too fragile to say out loud. And Min-suk, standing in their small rented room that smelled of damp carpet and someone else's cooking from the floor below, watched his son not ask the question. Watched him arrange his 3 books on the windowsill with the careful precision of a child organizing the things he still had, and felt something move in his chest that was old and heavy and deeply familiar. He had felt it before. Every time something had been present and then wasn't. The most dangerous form of power isn't presence. It's withdrawal after attachment has already formed. He knew this. He had known it going in. He had watched Jay attach and told himself it was manageable. Told himself the math still worked, that this was supplemental, temporary, a resource that would eventually reallocate itself because resources always did. Told himself he had not let his own weight settle. He had told himself a lot of things. None of them had held. On a Friday night, 3 weeks in, the city cold and the window fogged at the corners, Min-suk left Jay with the woman downstairs who sometimes watched him, put on his coat and walked. He didn't decide where he was going. His feet made the decision before he did. It took 40 minutes. The Drayton Grand Ballroom was hosting a private event again, different occasion, same structure. Light through the tall windows. Sound pressed against glass. The same choreography of exclusion made to look like elegance. Min-suk stood across the street. He didn't go in. He didn't have a plan. He just stood there on the pavement, in the cold, looking at the building that was the beginning of all of this. Trying to understand what he was doing here, what he had thought he would find, what answer he expected the building to give him that he hadn't already given himself. And then he heard it. 2 men. Coming around the building's east side, service entrance side, same corridor they had used that first night. Walking with the particular ease of men who didn't check whether they were being overheard. Omega's been flagged again. Same one. Someone ran his ID after the gala incident. Came back irregular. Hargrove wants him moved before the season ends. A pause. The boy too. Obviously. Laughter. Then the door closing behind them. Min-suk stood on the pavement. The cold had gotten into his coat. He didn't move. Flagged. Moved. He had heard those words before, in different rooms, from different mouths, but always carrying the same specific weight. The administrative language that people used when they had already made a decision and were in the process of making it someone else's paperwork. Disposable. That was the word underneath all the other words. He had always known they saw him that way. He had always known. But knowing a thing and hearing it said plainly, in that bored and casual tone, like it cost nothing, like it was obvious, like there was no other way to categorize him, were two different experiences. His hands were in his pockets. He found the edge of the notebook with one finger. He didn't pull it out. He just stood there, in the cold, holding onto the one thing that had always been his, the silence, the control, the careful contained architecture of himself, and felt it thin in a way he couldn't stop. The letter arrived on a Monday. Official seal. Heavy paper. The kind of envelope that had been designed to communicate authority before you even opened it. Minsak held it for a long time at the kitchen table, longer than made sense, turning it over once, then again, as though the back might say something different. It didn't. He opened it. Read it once. Set it down. Read it again. The language was formal but the meaning was plain. A formal complaint had been filed against him under 3 charges: unauthorized entry into a restricted private venue, identity documentation irregularities, and a review of his current child custody arrangement had been initiated based on concerns regarding, and here the letter used a phrase that had clearly been written by someone who had done this before. Instability of care environment. He had until Friday. Today was Monday. Jay was at school. Minsak sat at the table for a long time. Then he folded the letter, put it in the notebook, and began making a list of what he knew, what he had, and what he didn't. The list of what he didn't have was longer. He arrived at the hearing location on Friday morning 20 minutes early because that was the kind of thing he did. The small controllable things, the things that said I am present, I am not hiding, I am standing in whatever space this is, even if this space has already decided, and he had Jay with him because there was no one else. The building was not the Drayton Grand. It was smaller. Fluorescent lit. The kind of bureaucratic space that had been designed to be functional without being comfortable. Chairs in rows. A desk at the front. 3 people behind it. 2 men and a woman, all in formal clothing, all with a specific expression of people whose job was to make decisions about other people's lives and who had learned to do it with a certain professional distance. The room was not empty. There were other people there, observers, witnesses, some with legal representation beside them. And there were guests. Some of them Minsak recognized. The taller man from the gala. The woman in the wine-red gown, now in something grey. 3 others he had seen in the cluster that had been laughing. They weren't laughing now. They had the composed, satisfied look of people who had filed paperwork and were waiting to see it processed. Minsak found 2 chairs. He and Jay Saturday. Jay pressed close to his side. When injustice becomes routine, people stop questioning it. And then they start participating. The proceedings began. A woman at the front read the charges in a voice that was careful and practiced and emptied of feeling in a way that felt, somehow, worse than hostility. Hostility had heat. This was cold. This was the temperature of systems. Of forms. Of decisions made in the passive voice so that no single person had to own them. Unauthorized entry. Identity irregularities. Custody review. The crowd watched. Minsak sat straight. His hands were in his lap. His right hand covered his left wrist, not hiding it. Just resting there. Jay was not crying yet. He was doing the thing he did, the old eyes cataloging, the holding himself completely still, the specific quality of stillness that looked like calm from the outside but that Minsak knew, in his bones, was not calm at all. It was endurance. 6 years old and already fluent in endurance. A guard stepped forward. Read something from a page. Minsak's documentation, he said, could not be verified through standard channels. The taller man from the gala nodded once. The woman in grey looked at her hands. Jay's shoulder was pressing hard into Minsuk's arm. Minsuk didn't move. He kept his eyes forward. Kept his breathing controlled. Kept the wall up, the one that had taken years to build and that had never, not once, been fully breached, because breaching it cost things that couldn't be recovered. He heard someone say, a risk to the child's stability. He heard someone else say, a pattern of evasion. He heard, from somewhere in the room, barely a murmur but distinct, the voice of the taller man. I don't understand why this is taking this long. And from behind him, quiet and precise. Remove them. Jay made a sound. Small. He'd been holding it in and couldn't hold it anymore. It wasn't a word. It wasn't a sob. It was the kind of sound that comes from a body that has been bracing against something and finally, for one unguarded second, can't. Minsuk's jaw moved. His hand came up. Just slightly, pressed briefly to the top of Jay's head. Come back. Stay with me. The guard on the left stepped forward. His hand went to Minsuk's arm. Minsuk's eye stayed forward. He let the hand close around his arm. He let it. Because fighting, in this room, with this audience, with Jay beside him, fighting would give them the story they wanted. It would be its own kind of losing. His wrist throbbed under the guard's grip. The bruise. The old one, yellowed at the edges, never fully healed, throbbed. And the room watched. The same crowd that had laughed. The same crowd that had looked away. Now they watched with that particular quality of attention that wanted to see an ending, something clean and final that would let them walk out of here and go back to their lives with the matter resolved. The guard pulled. Minsuk moved with it. Jay reached for his hand. And from somewhere near the back of the room. From a direction no one had been watching, because no one had been watching that direction, a voice. Not loud. It didn't need to be loud. Stop. The guard didn't stop. That was the first mistake. He kept moving, kept his hand around Minsuk's arm, kept the pressure up, kept walking them toward the side exit like the word hadn't reached him, or like he had decided it didn't apply. The second mistake was what came next. He pulled harder. The force of it caught Jay off balance. The boy stumbled, his hand losing Minsuk's, and the sound he made when he stumbled, when the connection between them broke, was the kind of sound that cut through every layer of practiced composure a room might have assembled. Jay hit the floor on one knee. Got up immediately. Not crying. Just up. Chin raised. Eyes going straight to his father the way a compass needle finds north. Minsuk twisted, not a fight, not a struggle, just a rotation of the upper body toward his son. And the guard tightened his grip. On the bruised wrist. On the exact point that had been gripped before. And Minsuk, who had not made a sound in this room, who had sat through the charges and the careful bureaucratic language and the crowd's satisfaction and the taller man's voice saying remove them, made one now. Not loud. Not a word. A breath that had run out of room. The kind your body makes when pain arrives faster than your ability to suppress it. The worst kind of pain isn't inflicted. It's witnessed. And ignored. 3 people in the front row turned away. The woman in grey examined her sleeve. The taller man checked his watch. And Jay, 6 years old, already fluent in endurance, stood 3 feet away and watched his father get dragged and did not look away. Because he was his father's son. And his father had never looked away. The exit was at the far end of the room. Marble floor. Polished. The kind of surface that reflected everything. The ceiling, the lights, the people watching, and returned it all slightly distorted, slightly cold. The guard moved toward it. Minsuk moved with him. Not fighting. Not resisting. Just moving. But his eyes were open. Still open. Still forward. Still holding the line that said, I am here. I see this. I know what this is. Jay followed. Nobody stopped Jay from following. Because nobody was paying attention to Jay right now. They were watching the Omega, watching the exit, watching the thing resolve itself so they could leave, and Jay used that the way his father had taught him to use it, without being taught, just by being shaped by the same years. He walked 3 feet behind. Eyes on his father's back. The room was quiet. The kind of quiet that comes when everyone has agreed, without speaking, to let something happen. The marble caught every footstep. Every dragged step. Every small sound. And then, from the back of the room, from the direction no one had been watching, a sound. Different. Not a voice. Not a command. A crack. Sharp. Clear. The specific sound of something under pressure giving way, not shattering, not breaking apart, but cracking. The difference between an explosion and a fault line. The guard slowed. Not because he was told to. Because the sound had a quality to it that stopped movement involuntarily. The way certain sounds do, the ones that arrive before explanation, that the body processes before the mind. Everyone in the room turned. Karen Vale was standing at the back. He hadn't announced himself. He hadn't come through the main entrance, or if he had, no one had seen it happen. He was simply there, standing at the far end of the room, in a dark suit, completely still. His right hand was raised. In it, or what was left of it, a glass. Heavy crystal. Cracked along the base where his grip had closed around it. Not thrown. Not dropped. Crushed. A thin line of dark liquid ran along the edge of his palm. He didn't look at it. Didn't move to wipe it. He stood there with a cracked glass in a bleeding hand and looked at the guard. Looked at him the way you look at something you have already decided on. And the guard felt it. The grip on Minsuk's arm went slack. Not released. Just slack. The involuntary loosening of a hand when the body realizes it is standing in the wrong place. Minsuk felt it. His eyes came up. Found Karen across the room. He had not expected this. He had not, in 3 weeks of silence and cold tea and Jay's careful rearrangement of his books, he had not let himself expect this. Karen began walking. No rush. No announcement. Just forward motion, steady and unhurried, with the cracked glass still in his hand and the blood still moving slowly across his palm. The crowd did what crowds always did around Karen Vale. It moved. Not quickly. Not dramatically. Just moved. Adjusted. Redistributed itself into new configurations, leaving a clear path from where he stood to where Minsuk and the guard and Jay were clustered near the exit. Jay looked up. His face did something that had no clean name. Not surprise. Not relief. Something older than both of those things. The guard's grip dropped. Fully this time. Minsuk's arm came free. He didn't move toward Karen. He moved toward Jay, 1 step, immediate, no pause, his hand finding the top of his son's head and staying there. Karen came to a stop. 6 feet away. He looked at the guard. The guard looked at his own hands. Then at the floor. Then, slowly, stepped aside. Karen's eyes moved to the 3 people at the desk. He didn't address them yet. He looked at Minsuk. At the wrist. At the specific point where the guard's grip had been. His jaw moved. Once. Then he looked back at the room, at the taller man, at the woman in grey, at the crowd that was very still and very quiet, and the expression on his face was not anger. Anger was too warm. This was something colder. something that had taken time to reach this temperature. He held the cracked glass at his side. Let a drop fall. And said nothing yet. Release him. 2 words. He said them to the room, not to the guard specifically, because by then the guard had already stepped back, already removed his hands, already recalibrated everything about his posture in the way bodies do when they recognize they've been holding something they have no right to hold. But Karen said it anyway. For the record. For the room. 2 words that had the weight of everything that had been building for 3 weeks, 3 weeks of absence, 3 weeks of deliberate distance. Arriving now, here, at this temperature. The 3 people at the desk had stopped writing. The taller man from the gala had not moved since Karen walked in. The woman in grey was looking at her hands. Nobody spoke. Karen let the silence sit. He was good at that. He had always been good at that. At letting silence expand past the point of comfort, past the point where most people reached for something to fill it, and staying in it, completely still, until the room understood that the silence was intentional and that he was in no hurry for it to end. True power doesn't shout. It removes the need for resistance. He walked forward. Not toward the desk. Not toward the taller man. Toward Min-suk. He stopped 2 feet away. His right hand was still bleeding. Not dramatically, just the slow, dark line across his palm that came from holding broken glass too long. He hadn't looked at it once since entering the room. Hadn't shifted his grip. Hadn't made any adjustment that would indicate it mattered. It didn't, apparently. To him. He looked at Min-suk. Min-suk looked back. 3 weeks of nothing and now this. This room, this moment, Karen standing 2 feet away with a cracked glass and a bleeding hand and the same steadiness he had always carried, the same absolute unrushed certainty, like he had always known he would arrive here, had simply chosen the moment. Min-suk's jaw was tight. His eyes held something that wasn't gratitude and wasn't anger and wasn't relief. It was more complicated than any of those things. It was the expression of someone who had held themselves together through something difficult and was now being seen in the aftermath of holding, which was somehow harder than the holding itself. Karen didn't comment on it. He turned, slowly, with the full deliberateness of a man who knew exactly what a room saw when he moved, and faced the desk. These charges, he said, are being withdrawn. Not a request. The woman at the desk blinked. Sir, this proceeding has been formally withdrawn, Karen said again. Same volume. Same pace. The word landing with identical weight the second time. The man beside her touched her arm. Leaned in. Said something Min-suk couldn't hear. She wrote something. Nodded. Looked up. Looked back down. Karen moved toward the taller man. The man's posture, which had been settled, certain, the posture of someone who had come here expecting to watch something finished, changed. Not dramatically. Just enough. The shoulders lifting slightly. The weight shifting back an inch. Karen stopped in front of him. Looked at him the way you look at something you have fully assessed. He didn't speak immediately. Let the man stand in the look for a moment. Then, quiet and specific. You filed this. Not a question. The man's chin came up. There were legitimate concerns about. You filed this, Karen said again. Just that. The man went quiet. Karen leaned forward. Not much, just enough to close the remaining distance between public and private, and said something. Just to him. 3 seconds. Then straightened. The man's face had changed. He looked, for the first time since Min-suk had encountered him, like someone who was uncertain about what he had done. Karen turned back. Walked to where Min-suk stood. Jay was pressed into Min-suk's side now. both arms wrapped around him, face turned against his coat, the endurance finally giving way into something smaller and warmer and more honest. Karen crouched. Level with Jay. He waited until the boy turned. "You okay?" he said. Jay looked at him. Long enough that it became its own kind of answer. Then he nodded. Once. Karen stood. He placed the cracked glass on the nearest surface, a credenza near the side wall, set it down without a sound, and then turned to face the room one final time. The crowd. The same crowd that had watched. The same faces that had organized themselves into configurations of performance, of concerned citizenship and formal process and legitimate concern, while a child hit a marble floor and a man was dragged by his bruised wrist and nobody, not once, reached out a hand. Karen looked at them. All of them. Took his time. And then he spoke. Not loudly. He never needed to be loud. You mistook silence for weakness. A pause. You mistook absence for mercy. The room was completely still. Even the fluorescent light seemed quieter. He looked toward the taller man one last time. I wasn't gone. And then, that line. The one that had been building since he walked in, since the cracked glass, since the two words that cleared the room. I was preparing war. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Jay's arms tightened around Minsuk's waist. And Karen. Without waiting for a response, without offering an explanation, without giving the room anything else to take, turned toward the exit. Then stopped. Looked back. At Minsuk. His expression hadn't changed, still flat, still certain, still that particular quality of attention that had unsettled Minsuk since the beginning and had never stopped being unsettling, only changed in what it was unsettling toward. But there was something in it now. Underneath the surface of it. Small. Barely visible. The equivalent of what Karen Vale allowed himself when he had made a decision he intended to keep. He waited. Minsuk looked at him. Looked at Jay. Looked at the cracked glass on the credenza, the blood still visible on the crystal, and then back at Karen. He reached into his coat pocket. Pulled out the notebook. Opened it. Wrote 4 words. Turned it around. Held it up. Karen read it. His jaw shifted. Not quite a reaction. Not quite nothing. He turned back toward the exit. And walked. And after 3 seconds where the room held its breath and Jay looked up at his father and Minsuk stood with the notebook still open in his hand, they followed. The street outside was cold. Not the dramatic cold of storms or cinema. Just the ordinary cold of a city evening in the wrong season, the kind that finds the space between your collar and your jaw and settles there without permission. They walked 3 blocks before anyone stopped. Karen stopped first. At a corner. Nothing notable about it, just a cross street with a bench and a closed flower stand and a light that cycled from green to amber to red with the indifference of infrastructure. He turned. Minsuk and Jay came up behind him. Jay was holding Minsuk's hand. Both of them. Not the child being led grip, the other kind. The kind where both parties were holding equally. Karen looked at them. He looked at the notebook, which Minsuk was still carrying open. He didn't ask what the 4 words had been. He had read them. They both knew he had read them. In the room, when Minsuk had written them and turned the notebook around, Karen had read, "Where were you going?" And he had not answered. He answered now. "Nowhere," he said. Minsuk's eyes narrowed slightly. Karen met the look. "I wasn't gone," he said, "because I was done. I was gone because I needed the room to show me what it was going to do." Minsuk stared at him. The notebook came up. He wrote. Turned it. "You used us." Karen looked at those 2 words for a long moment. did not immediately disagree. Yes, he said. Pause. And I stayed. The light cycled. Red to green. Nobody crossed. Jay, between them, was looking at the closed flower stand with the particular focus of a child who has decided to let adults handle something and is giving them room to do it. His fingers were still in his father's. Still holding equally. Min-suk wrote again. Turned it. That's not an explanation. Karen read it. Something shifted in his face. Small, controlled, the kind of movement that was significant precisely because he was the kind of man where any movement was significant. No, he said. It's not. He reached into his jacket. Pulled something out. Set it on the bench beside him, a card, dark background, nothing printed on it except a number. The 4th floor, he said. Thursday. Min-suk looked at the card. Looked at Karen. Karen looked back. And that was when Min-suk understood. Fully, finally, in a way he hadn't let himself understand before, that this man was not going to offer a clean explanation. Was not going to frame this in a language that made it comfortable or certain or safe. Was not going to arrive with soft words and reassurance and all the packaging that people use to make power look like kindness. He was going to show up. That was it. That was the whole thing. Show up, stay present, act. And leave the understanding to build at whatever pace it was going to build, without pushing it, without performing it. It was the most complicated form of honesty Min-suk had ever been offered. And the most terrifying. He picked up the card. Held it. Karen placed his hand on Jay's head. Once. Brief. Like a period at the end of something. Then he looked up, past them, at the street, at something in the middle distance, and said, mostly to himself but not trying to keep it from them. You were never disposable. Min-suk went still. Those 4 words from the building across from the Drayton Grand, the overheard conversation, the 2 men coming around the east side, someone ran his ID, Hargrove wants him moved, came back. Karen knew. He had known. That was what the absence had been. Not withdrawal. Preparation. Pause on that. Because the room that had filed the charges, the taller man, the documentation irregularities, the formal seal and heavy paper. Those hadn't come from nowhere. They had come from something Karen had seen coming before Min-suk did. And Karen had stepped back, had created the space, the distance, the gap that had cost 3 weeks and too much, to let it arrive. To let the room show its hand. To show Min-suk. Because Min-suk needed to know what he was walking in. He needed to see it clearly, without Karen's presence blocking the view. The math changed again. Min-suk felt it changing. It was terrifying. He let it. Karen turned back. His eyes went to Min-suk's hand, the one holding the card, and then to his wrist. The wrist. That, he said, doesn't happen again. Not a promise. Not a comfort. A statement of fact. The kind that came from a man who had already decided and was informing you of the decision, not requesting your agreement. Min-suk looked at his own wrist. Then at Karen. He wrote. Turned it. 1 word. Okay. Karen read it. Nodded once. That was all. Then Jay, who had been very carefully studying the closed flower stand and giving the adults their room, looked up. He looked at Karen. At his father. At the card in his father's hand. And then, in the voice he used when he had been thinking something for a long time and had finally decided to say it. So, are you really staying this time? The street was quiet. The light cycled again. Karen looked at the boy. For a long moment he was completely still. That particular quality of stillness that Jay had stopped finding frightening around week 3 and had started finding solid, the way you find solid ground solid, not because it announces itself but because it holds. And then Karen Vale, who did not offer explanations or performances or reassurances, who showed up and stayed and let the rest build at its own pace. Looked at Minsuk first. Then back at Jay. And said, "Ask me again next Thursday." Jay blinked. Looked at his father. Minsuk was looking at the card in his hand. His thumb moved, just slightly, across the edge of it, holding it like something he was deciding not to put down. And in the cold ordinary air of that street corner, with the light green and nobody crossing and a city continuing on around them the way cities always do, completely indifferent to the things that change inside of people, something settled. Not loudly. Not completely. But it settled. And Jay, who was 6 years old and already fluent in endurance and had learned to hold every good thing loosely so it couldn't leave a mark when it left, slipped his free hand into Karen's. Didn't ask permission. Didn't wait. Just held. Power doesn't always arrive to save you. Sometimes, it waits until the world shows exactly who it is. And then it shows up on a Thursday. And stays. That story just showed you what strength really looks like, not the loud kind, not the kind that announces itself. The quiet kind. The kind that stays. If this story moved you, if you saw something in Minsuk's silence or in the way Jay held on without asking permission, share this. Someone in your life needs to hear it today. And if you want to be here when the next story drops, subscribe and turn on notifications. Every story on this channel is built for people who believe that the right person showing up at the right moment can change everything. Don't miss what's coming next. Drop a comment and tell me, what moment in this story hit you hardest? Was it the marble floor? The 4 words in the notebook? Or the moment Jay reached for his hand without waiting? Tell me. Your words might be exactly what someone else needs to read.